Hey, grammatike tehne conditionals. In this lesson, we'll cover a complete overview of how Greek conditionals work. So this is a fairly large, lengthy kind of overview lecture. We'll get into some of the weeds as we go, trying to give you a complete picture of how they work and also how to get your brain thinking in the patterns that they present. So a conditional period is a sentence with two parts, generally with this structure. If X, then Y. Throughout this lecture, we'll be using the following default example for our pattern. If I run fast enough, then I will receive the gold medal. The second clause here is an independent clause. That is, it can stand by itself. I will receive the gold medal. So that by itself is a clause and it's a statement. I will receive the gold medal. It's independent. The first clause is a dependent clause. It cannot stand by itself. So if I run fast enough, that isn't a sentence. It's incomplete. Notice too that the first clause, the dependent clause, is marked in English with if. The second clause, the independent clause, does not need to be marked. You don't need a then to mark the independent clause. The dependent clause is also referred to as the protasis, from the verb protino, as it is the part of the conditional that is extended forwards. That's the meaning of protino. Extended forwards as a premise or as a basis for the hypothetical statement that we're looking at. So the protasis. If I run fast enough, that's our protasis. The independent clause is also referred to as the apodosis. Apodosis, from the verb apodidomi, as it is the part of the conditional that is offered back as the answer in response to the condition. So the premise extends something forward, protasis. The apodosis responds in turn to the protasis. I will receive the gold medal. In traditional grammar books, especially learner-oriented ones, the conditionals are grouped together into 5 or 6 or 9 or other numbers, different combinations, where for each possible protasis plus apodosis, you are to deduce a particular meaning. So if the protasis has this and the apodosis has this, then it's XYZ type of conditional. That's the traditional approach. We're going to do something a little bit differently. Our approach here differs mostly in terms of pedagogy, not in ultimate conclusion. So there's nothing groundbreaking in terms of what I'm presenting. I haven't come up with any new theories of the conditional. But what we are going to do is pull apart the two halves of the conditional and walk and talk through them separately. So to think about the protasis options and the apodosis options and what they might mean by themselves before we put them together. Because actually the way you would hear and read and perceive these clauses needs to function independently. And if you can do that, you'll be able to hear and process them in real time. So part 2, the apodosis. Firstly, we're going to look at apodosis with an indicative and nothing else. So a bare indicative. Δέχομαι τον Στέφανον. Δέχομαι τον Στέφανον. I received the gold medal. Now, if you're paying attention, Stéphanon and gold medal are not direct equivalents, not direct translations. But in my terms, receive the gold medal is clear of meaning in English, and the best representation for that in Greek is ton Stéphanon. Δέχομαι τον Στέφανον. I will receive the gold medal. Εδέχομεν τον Στέφανον. I was receiving the gold medal. So here, εδέχομεν is in the paratatikos, the imperfect tense, and probably is to be taken in habitual sense. I was receiving the gold medal on several occasions as I continue to win year by year. Edexamen ton Stéphanon. I received the gold medal. I won the gold medal. So aoristos on one occasion or as a holistic kind of viewpoint. So here we have dechome, enestos chronos, dexome, homelon chronos, edechomen, paratatikos, and edexamen, aoristos, present, future, imperfect, aorist. All these stand by themselves, they're relatively straightforward. You can understand each of these clauses without any extra information. Now, apodoses with optative and an. And notice that we're dealing with the then part of the clause first. This is important. Because it can stand by itself, you need to be able to hear it by itself. So, dechoimenan ton Stephanon. Dechoimenan ton Stephanon. And I might possibly receive the gold medal. Dexaimenan ton Stephanon. I might possibly receive the gold medal. So here, the translation into English would be exactly the same. The choice of the aoristos, dexaimen, or the enestos, dechoimen, it would be really about the aspect of the action in view, not about time, because we're in the optative. And because we're in the optative with an, we're in a potential optative. So remember that optative with an expresses potentiality. Nothing different here. Just because it might be part of a conditional doesn't change the meaning. You would perceive the meaning the same way. Now, apodoses with indicatives and an. This is one of the very few situations where an appears with an indicative rather than a subjunctive or an optative. These occur where the verb is a secondary indicative. So a secondary indicative is something that's marked for past time, imperfect, aorist, or pluperfect forms, paratatikos, aoristos, hypersyntetikos, and it's paired with an. This usage expresses something that would or would have occurred if the conditions were fulfilled, and with a very strong understanding that the conditions weren't or aren't fulfilled. This is true whether you have a condition expressed or not. So that's a mouthful. Let's see how this works in practice. Edechomen an ton Stephanon. So edechomen paratatikos, imperfect, with an, I would be receiving the gold medal. Notice that this is an independent statement. You don't need an inner conditional to understand it. I would be receiving the gold medal. That is a sentence. Edexamen an ton Stephanon. I would have received the gold medal. Again, the combination of an indicative, secondary, past marking, edexamen, with an, puts you into a counterfactual situation. I would be receiving the gold medal. I would have received the gold medal. But understood, it's not taking place or it didn't take place. We can understand a bit of an ellipsis here. I would be receiving the gold medal if I were running today. But I'm not running today, therefore I'm not receiving the gold medal. Or I would have received the gold medal, edexamen an ton Stephanon. I would have received the gold medal, except that I broke my leg before the race. Something has made it not the case that this is true. Typically, the imperfect maps to the present, that is a now situation, and the aorist and pluperfect map to a past situation. If you have Latin, these circumstances map to the imperfect subjunctive and pluperfect subjunctive respectively. It's important, really it's important for your ability to process conditionals to learn to process an indicative with an an, a secondary indicative with an an, all by itself. Anytime you hear aorist or imperfect indicative with an, you should be thinking this would have been the case, but it's not. Now, apodosis with other things. There are other options. It is entirely possible to have an apodosis with any other independent clause possibility. Why? Because it's an independent clause. Because it can stand alone, it can do whatever it wants. You can put in an imperative. You can put in an impersonal construction. You can put in anything that works by itself. Part 3, the protasis. So now we're on to the if part. So we're actually kind of functionally working backwards. A protasis that mark a counterfactual. Protasis that mark counterfactuals. These are A with a secondary indicative. And so generally speaking, the protasis is always marked with a version of A. And here we're talking about A with a secondary indicative. Second indicative, to remind you again, anything marked for past time. Imperfect, paratatikos, aorist, aoristos, pluperfect, hypersynthetikos. And so these work in conjunction with the an indicative that we were speaking about before to produce a complete counterfactual period. Let's have a look at these in combination. Protasis first. A etrechon, if I were running. A edramon, if I had run. So etrechon, imperfect, edramon, aorist. Now let's put them into a complete clause, a complete period. E etrekon, edechomen an ton Stefanon. If I were running, I would be receiving the gold medal. There's a with imperfect indicative, and then an with imperfect indicative, result, present counterfactual. So to flip back to the traditional approach would be to say, okay, if you have a imperfect indicative and then you have an imperfect indicative, the result is present counterfactual. That's how you work out what's going on. What I want to impress upon you in this lecture is you can read and feel the force of these two components separately. You don't need to sum them to get the result. A etrechon, if I were running. And I'm going to come back to this a little bit later, but really there's no difference in Greek between if I were running and if I was running. In English, you need to make the distinction. In Latin, you do. I put it to you that a Greek speaker and reader hears a etrechon, and if I were running and if I was running is functionally the same. And then you hear edechomen an ton Stefanon, I would be receiving the gold medal. Stands by itself. E edramon, edexamenan ton Stefanon, shifting to the aoristos now. If I had run, I would have received the gold medal. A with an aorist indicative, and then an with an aorist indicative, past counterfactual. Note that it is also possible to mix these combinations. I apethanen ho heteros edechomen an ton Stefanon. So aoristos apethanen edechomen paratatikos. Imperfect. If the other runner had died, aoristos, I would be receiving the gold medal now. So because the condition is past referring, but the consequent is present, you can find this combination. In theory, you might find the other way around, where the if-then is not consequential, but evidentiary. For example, if there were dead bodies on the ground, there would have had to have been a slaughter here. Not all conditionals are about causality. Now, protasis with E and the optative, where it is future looking. Just as the optative elsewhere regularly expresses potentiality, especially optative with an, and that's what we saw in the apodosis, so the optative in the protasis indicates something that a speaker considers potential or possible, but fairly remote in terms of possibility. If X should, would, might possibly become the case. It doesn't have an an because A with the optative doesn't require an an, and just because we're in a potentiality doesn't require the an. But the A is moving us towards considering what is possible. A trechoimi. If I were possibly to run. A dramoimi. If I were possibly to run. So there's no distinction here in terms of tense. The choice of aspect is generally motivated in the protasis, generally motivated by whether the action in view, trechoimi, and its relationship to the apodosis is contemporaneous. If I were to run, something then would possibly happen at that time, or if it is sequential, if the action of the protasis is prior, anterior, then the aorist tends to be more likely. So, generally speaking, A with the optative in the protasis is matched with optative and an in the apodosis. Not always, but generally. E trechoimi, dechoimenan ton Stefanon. If I were possibly to run, I might possibly be receiving the gold medal. Edramoimi dexaimenan ton Stephanon. If I were possibly to run, I might then possibly receive the gold medal. So the shift from trechoimi to dramoimi shifts from something that's seen or treated as contemporaneous to something that's treated as sequential. E trechoimi dexaimenan ton Stephanon. If I were possibly to run, I might possibly be receiving the gold medal. E dramoimi dechoimenan ton Stephanon. If I were possibly to run, I might then possibly receive the gold medal. So the insertion of the then there is to highlight that sequentiality, and it depends upon I dramoimi. It doesn't depend upon dexaimen versus dechoimen in the apodosis. It depends upon what's happening in the protasis. 4 combinations. The first component, the protasis, tends to have to do with relationship between the two actions. The second one, the apodosis, the choice between present and aorist optatives, tends to be aspectual based on that action alone. This is where the protasis is future looking. So now we come to the protasis with A or E and the indicative. And I'm going to call these neutral conditions or conditionals. The choice of A with the indicative is relatively neutral to whether the condition is fulfilled. So at least so far as the condition goes, the speaker is assuming that it's true for the sake of argument. This language comes from the way Wallace approaches it in his Koine Greek textbook. I think it's a good way to put it. You can think of this as, over elaborating. If, and let's just say for the sake of argument that it's true, whether or not it's true doesn't really matter, then what follows? So assuming true for the sake of argument. Any indicative is possible here, except you'll remember we already discussed one combination, the A or the E with secondary indicative and then a secondary indicative with an. So let's go back to that for a second. This is really important. A protasis with A and the secondary indicative. These are neutral conditions that are actually counterfactuals. So in that combination, the speaker is presuming that the condition was unfulfilled. But here's what I think you need to refine our mental model a bit. For a counterfactual, the speaker presumes that the condition is not fulfilled or is unfulfillable, and then assumes that the condition is true to see what would be the case. But as you read or hear a Greek conditional, it's really the apodosis with an and then the secondary indicative that is alerting you to the speaker's presumption that the condition is unfulfilled. That is, firstly, when you hear the protasis, A with the secondary indicative, you are not told in Greek whether the speaker considers that counterfactual or not. This is where if I was running and if I were running are the same in Greek. It's all if I was running. Just as in some dialects of English today, it's all if I was running. There is no if I were running. So the protasis, the if part, doesn't tell you what the speaker thinks about that condition being unfulfilled. The apodosis does, because the apodosis tells you the information all by itself. When you hit a secondary indicative with an, that tells you that the speaker considers the condition unfulfilled or unfulfillable. And this helps you tease out the difference between presumption and assumption. The speaker presumes that the condition is unfulfilled. Whether they know that to be true or not, they presume that it's unfulfilled or unfulfillable, but then they assume the condition is true to see what would be the case. So let's return to our examples. I etrechon. The hero hears this and thinks, okay, assuming that they were running, what would be the consequence? Edecho menan ton Stephanon. And then they hear this and they understand, the consequence would be that they would receive the gold medal, but actually this isn't the case. I think the protasis sets you up to consider what the consequence is. It's the apodosis that tells you that it isn't the case. Itrecho decho me ton Stephanon. If I am running, I am receiving the gold medal. I edramen edexatot son Stephanon. If she ran, so edramen shift to the third person, edexatot son Stephanon. In this example, you might suppose that I simply don't know whether a third party was running the race or not. I don't know if she ran. Someone says, oh, who won the race? And I might ask, oh, is so-and-so in the race? Because if she ran, she received the gold medal. I consider it certain that on the assumption that she ran, she received the gold medal. But I don't know. That's why I shifted to the third person, because if it's the first person, I presumably should know whether I ran or not. I etrekon edechomen ton Stefano. If I was running, I was receiving the gold medal. Here we're in the imperfect, the paratatigos, and I suspect, again, a habitual kind of thing where you view a season of races. And I'm like, well, if any particular race I was running, I was receiving the gold medal. I etrekon edexatot ton Stephanon. If she was running, she received the gold medal. So here we've shifted to the third person again, and I've shifted the aspect choice for the first part, the protasis, but I've maintained edexatot ton Stephanon in the apodosis. If she was running, she received the gold medal. I treko dos mu ton Stephanon. If I am running, give me the gold medal. I treko decho me ton Stephanon. If I am running, then let me receive the gold medal, shifting decho me into the hypotactike, into the subjunctive. So this is a reminder that the apodosis can be anything. The apodosis can be anything. But these are a regular kind of overview of neutral conditions. In each case, I'm assuming the protasis, and then I'm giving what the consequence is, whether it's in the past, whether it's in the present, whether it's future looking, or whether there's some other consequence that should follow. So now we just need to say a little bit about E with the indicative with futures. The combination of E with a future indicative and then a future indicative in the apodosis is often classified as future most vivid, emotional future, minatory future. This is because 1, its use is rare. 2, unlike other future referring options, the apodosis with a future indicative sounds very definite and determined. It will happen. And then 3, often a negative outcome or consequence is in view. The fact that a future indicative is used does give force to the vividness of the combination. The fact that it's often negative, however, is not what makes it negative. It's the fact that the context and the contents are negative. That's all you need to say. The fact that people often use it to make something vivid and forceful is why it's so appropriate to threats, appeals, and warnings and the like. So when we turn to our example, that's what we have. Isu drame, if you run, drame shifts to a middle in the future. Isu drame to skelosu rexo, I will break your leg. If you run the race, I will break your leg. So future action in view, and then a future correlation, here kind of a consequence, with a negative implication. But that's not part of the construction itself. The contents of the semantics of the apodosis tell you whether it's negative or not. Now we turn to protasis with ean and the subjunctive. And that ean is the combination of e and an, or e and an, and then it gets through crassus, you get ean, en, an in some dialects with a long alpha. But first we need to go on a little bit of a tangent. If we want to understand the force of an, we need to feel the way an works in a few other contexts. So I'm going to give us a few statements here, and I'm going to use temporal statements in particular. So alpha. Hote u polemiu prostas pulas esan, elpis hemin udemia en. When the enemy, polemioi, prostes pulas esan, when they were at the gates, elpis hemin udemia en, there was no hope. Elpis udemia, there was no hope for us. Hemin. Here, the time in view of hote is definite. The speaker has a clear view of the time, and it's past. Esan en. At that point, and I know what point I'm talking about, the point when the enemy was at the gates, at that point there was no hope. Β. Χωτάν hypelemiu prostes poulas osin, elpis hemin udemia en. Χωτάν, whenever the enemy were at the gates, there was no hope for us. So we've shifted to Χωτάν and then we get osin, subjunctive, hypotaktike. The elpis hemin udemia en, there was no hope. Again, we're past referring, and I'm saying whatever point it was that the enemy were at the gates, and perhaps I don't know, but I know that they were, and so the time in view is indefinite. I know that the event happened because there was no hope at that point, but I don't know exactly when. You might imagine a siege in Alpha. I'm looking down and I can see the enemy reach the gates, and I say, that's the point at which hope left us. In Beta, perhaps I'm inside the fortress and I don't know, but I know after the fact that the point that they reached the gates, that was the turning point. So it's certain, but the time itself is indefinite. Gamma. Χωτάν hypelemiu prostes poulas osin, elpis hemin udemia estin. Here the shift is in the second part, elpis udemia estin. Present tense estin. English, whenever the enemy are at the gates, there is no hope for us. So now we've shifted out of the indefinite to something more general. Whenever, and I have no particular definite moment in mind, there is no hope for us. This could be present or future referring to. I could say whenever the enemy are at the gates, this could be in the middle of the siege, or this could be, looking towards a siege, there's no hope for us at that point. It could also be general. That is, we might be a city that is continually being besieged, and every time the enemy gets to the gates, that's the point at which there's no hope for us. Delta, χωτάν hypelemiu prostes poulas osin, elpis hemin udemia este. Whenever the enemy are at the gates, there will be no hope for us. This shifts back to a kind of indefinite as well, but it's future-oriented. It's future-oriented by the estai or the este. And so at whatever point the future enemies get to the gates, that is the point at which there will be no hope. I consider it likely that they'll get there. I have a prospective view that that's probably going to happen. And when that condition is fulfilled, this is what the consequence will be. Whether that's causal or correlation or logical. But the correlation is at that point, that's the point there is no hope. So the an here, the an through Veta, Gamma, Delta, and the way that functions in relation to the N, Estin, Esa, that's the thing that's going to carry over into our conditions. Eandramo. If ever I run. If ever I run. You probably wouldn't use the ever in English necessarily, but it really does help to over-translate these if you're translating. Eantreko, if ever I run. Just like with the euktike, with the optative, the A with the optative, the choice here of aspect of dramo, aoristos versus treko, enestos tends to be motivated by, is the action simultaneous? That will be eantreko, or is the action anterior, eandramo. So when it's future referring, eandramo dexometon stephanon. If ever I run in the future, and it's relatively possible that I will run, I will receive the gold medal. So it has a similar force to example delta before, delta. That is, I don't know when I will run, but if ever I fulfill that condition, the consequence is dexometon stephanon. This combination is typically or variously called future more vivid, prospective, third-class conditional. The fulfillment is reasonably possible within a range from likely to hypothetical, but it's not as extreme as the optative, if possibly I ever run, and it's not as neutral as if I run. Often it's a question of who will fulfill the condition or when will it be fulfilled. Then if we have a non-future, eandramo dechometon stephanon. This tends to be a more general condition rather than an indefinite condition. So if ever on any particular occasion I run, I receive the gold medal. That's the distinction between dechome and dexome, even though the protasis remains the same. If ever on any particular occasion, if I run, I receive the gold medal. And it's a question of when and whenever this condition is fulfilled. It's worth considering the difference between then neutral and general. The neutral condition, e trecho dechome ton Stephanon. If we over-translate this, the notion of assumption, if I run and suppose for the sake of argument I do, I receive the gold medal. So there's no particular prospect or assumption that I'm making about the possibility or probability of e trecho. I'm just making a statement. If I run, then I receive the gold medal. A general condition differs like this. E andramo dechome ton Stephanon. If on any particular occasion I run, and in fact I do run sometimes, and I'm quite likely to run on some particular occasion, I receive the gold medal. So the ean shifts us into the fact that it's a possible situation, and its condition is quite liable to be fulfilled. Whereas A is much more standoffish about that condition being fulfilled. The ean with subjunctive, if you're a Latinist, generally matches the C with a present subjunctive, where the present subjunctive is non-past in its scope. This also helps make clear why Greek does not use its subjunctive forms to form those counterfactuals. Because the form of the subjunctive in the Greek, dramo, trecho, etc., is not determined by tense and can't form a counterfactual in that way, because the form of the subjunctive, present aorist perfect, is doing something else. It's showing us aspect and temporal relation to the apodosis, so that's not a choice that's available. That's why the an with the indicative has to do the work of the counterfactual. Now it's time for us to kind of rewind a little bit. Protasis with A and the optative, but past looking. So earlier on we looked at protasis with A and the optative. That was future looking, if something might possibly be the case. But here we're looking at ean dramo dechome ton Stephanon. So here we have ean with dramo, the hypotactic at the subjunctive. This is what we were just looking at, right? Ean subjunctive and then a present indicative. A general condition. If on any particular occasion I run, and in fact I do run sometimes, I'm quite likely to run on some particular occasion, I receive the gold medal. This is kind of a present general conditional. Now, speaking generally, what happens when you want to move a subjunctive into the past? In Greek, particularly classical Greek, you shift from the subjunctive to the optative and you drop the an. And you shift the indicative as well. E dramoimi e dechomen ton Stephanon. So I've shifted the dramo out of the subjunctive into the optative. I've dropped the an, and I've shifted the apodosis into the past as well, because everything is moving into the past. You could understand this as if ever on any particular past occasion, if I were to have run, if ever on any particular past occasion I ran, edechome ton Stephanon, I used to receive the gold medal. This is a past generalizing statement. Once more. Edramoimi edechome ton Stephanon. If ever on any particular past occasion I ran, I used to receive the gold medal. Lastly, a few words about mixed conditionals and perfects. Mixed conditionals. Mixed conditionals are where your protasis and your apodosis don't line up to the lovely tables found in textbooks. For example, when you have a protasis that's a neutral, but the apodosis is potential. Generally speaking, mixed conditionals shouldn't cause you a problem if you've adopted the kind of a way of thinking about this that I'm suggesting. That is, if you can functionally read the protasis and the apodosis separately and gain their meaning separately, the components individually, then the combination, when it doesn't match up to any kind of standard combination, each half retains the sense it should have. The other thing to consider are perfects and pluperfects. Generally speaking, I've avoided talking about perfects and pluperfects in the conditionals, but they do occur. Just keep in mind that the perfect is a primary sequence form, like the present, and the pluperfect is a secondary sequence form, like the aorist. And so the perfects and the pluperfects tend to retain the aspectual force of the perfect. That's why they are selected. Thanks for your patience in working through this lecture on Greek conditionals. I would go out now and I would start to see them in the wild and start to get a feel for them. That's what's going to carry them into your brain and give you an operating ability to work with them in the Greek. Ευχαριστώ χυμήν και εις αύτης ερώστε.